In this session, let us continue to look at the text of the poem and understand the meaning. Stanza 5. We are talking about the poem The Garden. Lines 33 through 36. What wondrous life is this I lead! Ripe apples drop about my head. The luscious clusters of the vine up I'm sorry upon my mouth do crush their wine. Now we are in stanza 5, and our speaker seems excited to be here. What wondrous life is this I lead! And as you might have noticed, it sounds remarkably different in tone than what we have encountered in the previous stanza. This is what we called a volta. Volta is an Italian word meaning turn, and in poetry, it represents the specific place in a poem where the speaker's train of thought shifts, changes abruptly, or turns. Words like but and yet or alas are common indicators that a volta might be right round the corner. But here the transition is more subtle, means not obvious. The shift in thought is really more like a shift in argument. The speaker turns from his argument that nature is better than society and begins talking instead about why nature is so awesome. The speaker does a great job of making the garden sound like the sweetest place on earth. Ripe apples falling in from the trees, grapes leaking their juices into his mouth, etc. Actually, it also sounds a little too good to be true. This passage also marks where the garden really becomes a pastoral poem as opposed to a poem that just talks about nature. A pastoral is a poem that represents nature in an idealized and unrealistic form, as opposed to describing nature as it actually appears. So, while we know that apples do get ripe and fall from trees, and grapes are occasionally leaky, means the juice comes out, the romanticized, totally perfect, blissful way in which it is described here is a little too perfect to be taken at face value. Nature is also proactively giving the speaker everything he wants. He is not picking the apples, they are dropping right in front of him. The luscious clusters of grapes. The word luscious means juicy and clusters means गुच्छा. हिंदी में जिसको हम गुच्छा कहते हैं, अंगूर के गुच्छे, are squeezing themselves into his mouth. No effort is needed here. This no work necessary description of nature creates the idea that nature is awesome because it's a place that is both luxurious and relaxing. In an era where being outside is more likely to be associated with plowing the fields than playing in gardens, this is an important distinction to make. Lines 37 to 40. The nectarine and curious peach into my hands themselves do reach, stumbling on melons as I pass, ensnared with flowers I fall on grass. The wording here is pretty clear. Fruit is so plentiful that it is literally rolling itself into the speaker's hands. There are so many melons, he can't even find a place to walk. And even if he does trip up, means stumble and fall, it does not matter because he's falling on a soft, cushy bed of grass. Once again, we see nature proactively giving the speaker everything he needs: fruit, melons, flowers, a nice place to lie down. The garden has got it covered. The idea of the speaker falling introduces some of the biblical imagery. specifically Garden of Eden, that will become more prevalent in stanza 8. Adam and Eve's decision to eat the forbidden fruit is commonly referred to as the fall of man. The speaker also falls into his garden, but his fall reinforces the idea of the garden as a safe and relaxing place. He is ensnared with flowers, not by Satan, and falls on grass instead of into sin and eternal damnation. Stanza 6, lines 41-42. Meanwhile, the mind from pleasures less withdraws into happiness. While our speaker is physically busy relaxing in the garden, his mind, it seems, is busy as well. To be precise, the mind is withdrawing into its happiness, or basically getting itself to a perfect state where the mind can do what it loves to do, and that is think. Lines 43 to 46. The mind that ocean where each kind does straight its own resemblance find, yet it creates transcending these far other worlds and other seas. In line 43, we see the mind described as that ocean. Since we know the mind is not actually an ocean, this means we have a metaphor on our hands. But before we can really dive into the meaning of that metaphor, there are some things you really need to know about 17th century philosophy. The logic behind this mind is ocean metaphor goes back to a theory about nature that was in vogue back in Marvell's day, namely that for every species on land, there is a corresponding species that lives in the ocean. Ever heard of manatees referred to as sea cows or tuna called the chicken of the sea? It is kind of like that, except that the theory goes further and says that there is a tuna is equal to chicken kind of equation for every single species on earth. Now, Marvell's metaphor compares the mind to the ocean. But what he's really trying to say is that just like all the ocean creatures correspond to all the land creatures, the mind has in it a corresponding image for every object in the world. Think of it like this. You have seen a desk before, yes? Okay. So now you can picture what that desk looks like in your mind. A desk isn't physically in your head, but there is an image of a desk in your mind that you can call up should you ever need to remember what a desk looks like. But we are not done yet. Marvell has to take the metaphor even further to get to his real point, which goes something like this. The mind is capable of holding all these images of things that exist in the real world, but it is also capable of creating worlds of its own. That is, imagining things that do not exist in real life. The speaker of the garden thinks these images that the mind creates transcend or surpass any images that are merely remembered or absorbed from the physical world. For example, no one has seen the soul, but using our minds, we can think about the soul and imagine what it might be like. This, according to the speaker, is the highest and best level of thinking. And being in the garden is a good thing because it seems to help the speaker reach the higher level. Lines 47-48. Annihilating all that is made to a green thought in a green shade. We are going to preface this section of the summary by telling you that this is one of the most debated and famous passages, not of this poem, but of Marvell's poetry in general. And that is saying a lot because the man talks about some pretty complex stuff. Okay, on with the analyzing. We are still talking about the imagination or the capacity of the mind to create and imagine things that don't exist in the physical world. These images that the mind comes up with annihilate or obliterate means to wipe out or remove, पूरी तरीके से किसी चीज़ को नष्ट करके हटा देना. All images of things that do exist in the physical world. Another definition of annihilate is to treat as non existent, which we think works perfectly with what Marvell is trying to say. But what does it mean to annihilate something to a green thought in a green shade? There are theories, but no definitive answers. Let us take it piece by piece. What do you think a green thought is? A good place to start is to go back to other places in the poem where Marvell has mentioned the color green. Remember back in stanza 3 when the speaker talked about green as amorous? But also remember that he is not talking about amorous in the normal sense. The speaker has got a thing for trees. So, a green thought is possibly a kind of sort of romantic thought about nature, which makes sense because if you are thinking about nature, you are likely thinking about things that are green. The same principle applies for figuring out in a green shade. Our speaker is in a garden and we know he feels that being in the garden allows him to think better. So, a green thought in a green shade is talking about an original kind of sort of romantic thought about nature made while in nature. Put all together, the lines say, the mind rejects thinking about what exists in the world in favor of coming up with original thoughts about nature. And original thoughts about nature can only occur while the person thinking them is actively in the natural world. Stanza 7. Lines 49 to 52. Here at the fountain sliding foot, or at some fruit tree's mossy root, casting the body's vest aside, my soul into the boughs does glide. We get to stanza 7 and our speaker is kicking it. He's relaxing at the base of a fountain. He's leaning up against a nice mossy fruit tree root and just generally having a grand old time. But while his body is stationary, his soul is just waking up. The body's vest is another way of saying skin. So our speaker is talking about an actual out of body experience. His soul is gliding away into the trees, but he doesn't seem concerned about it at all. The soul, in fact, is running the whole show. We don't know where this is going, but it sure has gotten good. Lines 53 to 56. There like a bird it sits and sings, then wets and combs its silver wings, and till prepared for longer flight, waves in its plumes the various light. Describing what the soul is up to is apparently a little tricky. So Marvell uses another simile to make things more clear. The speaker's soul is like a bird. This soul bird seems happy too. It's singing, sitting, singing, and getting its feathers all fancy. The bird is also preparing for longer flight, which brings in the second part of our simile. Indirectly, the migration of a bird is compared to the death of the speaker. The longer flight is actually the permanent separation between soul and body at the time of natural death. You might think that death would be a downer, but the speaker's soul seems very okay with the idea. Its preparation seems actually very pleasant and relaxing. Why do we think our speaker is able to be so calm? Poetic devices like alliteration and consonance don't play a huge role in the garden, but we did notice some S sounds appearing pretty frequently in this passage. They are soft, breathy, and contribute to the overall relaxing tone of the stanza. Stanza 8, lines 57 to 60. Such was that happy garden state, while man there walked without a mate. After a place so pure and sweet, what other help could yet be meet? The such was that open stanza 8 refers immediately back to the situation being described in stanza 7. Remember where the speaker's soul was flying around like a bird? Apparently the speaker thinks that is what it was like in the Garden of Eden, that happy garden state, before Eve came along and ruined everything. The speaker can't imagine why God would have thought it necessary to add anything to his creation after making Adam. That is interesting because without Eve, more people could possibly not have existed. Line 60 is a fairly direct reference to a Bible verse in Genesis. And the good Lord God said, "It is not good that the man should be alone. I will make him an helpmeet for him." So, does this mean our speaker is yearning for solitude, flies in the face of what God ordained back at the beginning of time? Or is this just another example of Marvell's famous wit? Line 61 to 64. But it was beyond a mortal's share to wander solitary there. Two paradises it were one in one, to live in paradise alone. The speaker seems resigned to the fact that his dream of solo paradise will never actually come true. But that does not mean he is giving up the chase. Lines 63 and 64 are super famous. They essentially say that living in paradise would be great and living by yourself would be paradise. So it would be a double paradise if you could live in paradise and not have to share it with anyone else. And we are sure Marvell meant to include that it would be three paradises in one if he lived blissfully alone. Also, a quick point about tone. Did you notice how lines 63 and 64 sound kind of like an aphorism or proverb? They make a profound point but do it in an incredibly concise, clean kind of way. This is very typical of Marvell's poetry. He picked the style up from classical authors, but always makes sure to mellow out the terseness with a little flowery language. That way, the poem sounds succinct, means brief, and clean without becoming too harsh. Stanza 9, lines 65 to 68. How well the skilful gardener drew of flowers and herbs this dial knew, where from above the mildest sun does through a fragrant zodiac run. In line 65, The speaker praises the gardener for the work he has done. Using another metaphor, Marvell compares the speaker's garden to a sundial made of flowers and herbs. We recommend checking this out if you want to know more about how sundials work. According to the metaphor, the changing of the seasons turns the flowers into mini sundials. You can follow the passing of time by watching the flowers bloom, grow, and fade in the same way that you can track time by keeping your sundial handy. The fragrant zodiac is really just another way of restarting the metaphor. Different zodiac signs correspond with certain positions of the sun in the sky. So, the fragrant zodiac is the different flowers and herbs that bloom and wither at different times of the year. ज़ोडिएक साइंस वो जो हमारी राशि के चिन्ह होते हैं, मीन, मेष, वृश्चिक, सिंह, कन्या आदि, वो इंग्लिश में ज़ोडिएक साइंस कहलाते हैं. This can also be looked at from a spiritual perspective, where God is the gardener clockmaker and the sundial measures not just the passing of a day or a year, but the life of the speaker. Line 69 to 72. And as it works, the industrious bee computes its time as well as we. How could such sweet and wholesome hours be reckoned but with herbs and flowers? We are still working with the sundial metaphor in the final lines of the poem, except now a new piece has been added, and that is the bee. The bees are presented as being industrious and computing their time or keeping track of their days. Industrious means hardworking. Their most logical metaphorical counterpart then is people. In other words, bees work as hard as us people. Marvell even comes out and says it in line 70. The bees compute their time as well as we. This could mean that they do just as good of a job as we do, but it could also mean that bees keep track of time just like humans do. The last two lines of the poem bring everything together. Our speaker, like the bees, chooses to spend his hours in the garden amongst the herbs and flowers. But if we switch gears and go back to imagining the garden as a sundial, the sentiment still works because the herbs and flowers are literally being used as ways to keep track of time. With this, we end the text of the poem. In the next, we will look at some critical material about the poem The Garden by Andrew Marvell. Thank you.